This is a U.S. Navy seaplane flying into a snowstorm just off the coast of Antarctica. On board are 9 men taking part in a secret mission to claim Antarctica for the USA. As they approach land, the storm gets even worse, and the crew lose all visibility, until suddenly, bang! The plane hits a mountain and comes crashing down into the snow. It was the most remote plane crash ever, and it left the crew stranded and badly injured in the world's toughest environment. But despite the incredibly harsh conditions, 6 of the crew members managed to survive for 13 days until they were finally rescued. We modeled the entire thing to show you how this incredibly brave group of humans managed to stay alive, and the rescue mission that eventually saved them. In 1946, a year after World War II, the U.S. turned its attention to Antarctica. This unclaimed vast stretch of land had untapped potential, and it seemed that the next war would be fought over who owned it. And so, in December 1946, the U.S. sent a huge expedition of 13 ships, 33 planes, and 5,000 men to Antarctica, with the secret mission of scouting out the continent, setting up bases, and claiming Antarctica as their own. One of the first flights to head out was the crew of George 1, made up of 9 young men, 2 pilots, radiomen, machinists, a navigator, a photographer, and the ship's captain. The journey was rough, and the extremely cold weather stopped the plane from getting above 300 meters. After 3 hours, they finally reached the coast, but the conditions were now worse than ever, and the crew couldn't see anything. The plane's altimeter was getting confused by the thick layer of ice beneath them and showed that the crew were still 300 meters above the ground. But little did they know that the land was actually right beneath them and rising quickly. Frenchie, the pilot, made the call to abandon the mission and turn back. But just as he was about to do this, the plane slammed into a mountain and tore a giant hole in the hull. 5,000 liters of fuel ignited immediately, causing a huge mid-air explosion. The plane came crashing down, scattering debris and its crew all over the ice. It was a complete disaster. Sadly, both Henderson and Lopez died immediately after being thrown through the plane's propellers. The rest of the crew were alive, but Frenchie was badly burned and could barely move. Fred Williams was even worse, with a broken back and several injuries to his face. It seemed almost certain that he would die. Instincts kicked in, and the crew immediately set up shelter in the plane's tunnel section, which had been ripped apart from the rest of the aircraft. They found a parachute and attached it to the end of the tunnel to stop the wind and snow from blowing in. After searching through the debris, they found sleeping bags, tents, and some food rations, mainly consisting of canned meat and soup. Not knowing when or if someone would ever find them, the crew retreated into their shelter to wait out the storm. Williams was too injured to be moved, and so the crew built a shelter around him using a sleeping bag and large pieces of debris. A few hours later, Robbins went out to check on Williams, but he had already drifted off to sleep, taken by the cold Antarctic conditions. Now, just 6 of the crew members remained, and their hopes of survival relied completely upon being found. But their supply ship, Pine Island, was 500 kilometers away, and finding their wreckage would be extremely difficult. Back at the ship, the crew of Pine Island began planning a rescue mission. The last bit of data they had placed the crew around here. But without knowing when the plane went down, the crew could have been anywhere. In order to rescue the crew of George 1, the men on Pine Island had to find them and somehow rescue them with a plane that could only land on water. The weather around the ship remained terrible for another 3 days, and so no rescue missions could be launched. Back on the crash site, the 6 survivors were slowly freezing to death in a negative 20-degree blizzard. Frenchie was in a really bad way, and his burns meant that he could barely open his mouth. He was slowly dying of frostbite and dehydration. Yet, thanks to the cold and dry conditions, infections, which would have killed him by now, hadn't spread due to the lack of bacteria. Despite all of this, Frenchie never complained once, and he always tried to crack a joke whenever he could. After some more searching around the debris, Robbins found a gas stove and managed to power it by siphoning fuel from one of the plane's spare tanks. He then became the de facto chef of the whole crew, cooking them 2 meals a day, spinach soup followed by peanut butter on bread. On day 4, the weather finally cleared, and the sun was now showering them in light. Despite the situation, they were completely overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of the location. They used this break in the weather to properly bury their dead crew members under the snow. In order to make it easier for recovery crews to find them, they placed metal objects inside the graves that could be picked up by magnetometers. On day 5, the crew of the crash site were running out of fresh food and would soon be down to just cans of dry meat. That day, Robbins went out to look for more equipment and found a camera that belonged to Lopez, the photographer who died in the crash. He took some pictures of the crash site and stored the film in his sleeping bag so he wouldn't forget it. On day 7, the weather around the ship finally cleared, and a rescue plane left Pine Island in search of the crew. Using the last confirmed location of the plane, the rescue team started scanning the ground back and forth in a ladder search pattern. As they reached land, the weather became overcast and any hopes of seeing the crew had disappeared behind a sea of fog. At this exact moment, Frenchie woke up in a daze and said he heard the sound of a plane in the distance. He hadn't heard anything. He was simply dreaming about being rescued. But as it turned out, the plane had actually passed within 20 kilometers of the crew. Over the next few days, the stormy weather returned once again, and spirits were at an all-time low. The crew were desperate, so they created a large pile of debris that could be set on fire to catch the attention of any nearby plane. Robbins also found some yellow paint and left a note on the wing for their rescuers to see. The crew were running out of time, but their luck was about to change. On the morning of day 13, the good weather finally returned, and the crew were having breakfast, which at this point was just a few slices of apricots. All of a sudden, a low rumble started shaking the ground, getting stronger and stronger until the Pine Island crew had finally found their lost crewmates. The survivors ran out, waving their arms in the air. Their suffering seemed to be finally over. But without landing gear or a safe place to touch down, there was no way for the plane to rescue them. They dropped a note down to the crew that said, "If you can walk to the lake 10 miles north, join hands and form a circle. If you cannot, form a straight line." They immediately formed a circle and began strapping Frenchie to a sled before setting out on their toughest journey yet. Looking back, their plane was now just a tiny speck on the landscape, and they realized just how lucky they were to have been found at all. The route to the lake was tough. Pulling Frenchie through the chest-high snow took them almost 12 hours. The rescue plane followed them most of the way, dropping occasional supplies to mark the route and snapping this picture along the way. The plane went on to make a perfect landing on the lake, and 2 men went out to look for the survivors. But suddenly, a thick bank of fog rolled in, leaving both groups completely blind. The survivors knew they were getting closer, as they could hear the distant sound of a plane. But just as they thought they had made it, they came across a 20-meter-high cliff, the final barrier between them and the lake. Amazingly, an almost perfect path just to the left led the way, almost as if it had been placed there to save the crew. After carefully making it down onto the ice shelf, out of the mist came 2 men. After 2 weeks of sheer terror and misery, they were finally reunited with their crew. They climbed aboard the rescue plane, and all 6 men safely made it back to the ship. It was one of the most unbelievable tales of survival and bravery, and all 6 men went on to tell the tale. As for the 3 lost men, they remain buried, perfectly preserved, under 80 years' worth of ice and snow, which will now be over 100 meters deep. The camera that Robbins found never made it out of the crash site. Its pictures, which would no doubt be worth 1,000 words, are just waiting to be discovered one day. Sadly, no one has ever returned to this fabled location to recover the 3 men. To learn more about what the 6 survivors went on to do with their lives, check out the page on our website, Primal Nebula. And now, for the Primal Space giveaway. The winner of the previous giveaway is Alexander. Congrats, like the video, and leave a comment saying what you think about this incredible story. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.